This demonstration will cover the basics of doing animation in Maya. I'll demonstrate the techniques involved with creating a ball bouncing animation. I'll start with a simple NURB sphere, and presuming that the grid here is the ground plane, I'll move this into position as if it were sitting on the ground. Now, for a ball to sit directly on the ground, I generally like to have it actually pass into the ground just a little bit, so it's just below the plane, because if it sits exactly perfectly on the ground, then it looks like it's floating. So now that it's in position, I will first group the sphere and rename this group to ball rotate. Then choose modify center pivot. Now the reason I have it grouped is so that anything that I want to change about this sphere, whether it's adding more geometry to it or replacing the geometry with something else, I can animate only on the transform node on the group and not worry about what the geometry underneath is doing. I also want to group this again, and I grouped via the hotkey Control G. And now if I shift click the plus next to that group, it expands the entire hierarchy. I'll rename this group to ball scale. Now because the sphere is positioned relative to the world origin as if it's sitting directly on that point, this new group pivot is exactly where it should be. If I want to do squash and stretch with this ball, I can squash it up and down, or stretch it up and down and squash it in and out. And I'll group it one more time and call this ball translate. So you can see I have three groups in place. Now the reason I have these three groups is because the rotation of the ball will happen underneath or inherit from the scaling of the ball, so that I can squash the ball and stretch it, and then after that transform is applied, I can rotate within the group. So any orientation that the ball has, if it's rolling along or bouncing, it can roll within the squash and stretch. Now there are more advanced tools for creating squash and stretch, but we'll do it simply with just a transform node for now. I'm going to undo a few steps to get everything back to their 0 positions. Let's change this scale back to 1. And with these three groups, I also want to make sure that I don't do animation on channels that shouldn't have animation. So for the translate node, I want to select every channel except for translate, and I want to get those locked so that I don't see them. I'm going to choose lock selected from this context menu, and you can see this little gray mark appears next to them. And in the attribute editor, they appear grayed out as well. That means I can't change or keyframe them. For the scale group, I want to then lock up everything except for scale. And for the ball rotate group, everything except rotate will be locked. Now I can see clearly the ones that are locked, but I may want to hide those channels just to simplify my viewport. So I will right-click and choose Hide Selected. And I'll do that for all of the locked channels on each of these groups. Now each one has only the three channels that are appropriate to the animation that I want to perform on them. Now that the basic setup is ready, let's talk a little bit about the interface. I have a time slider that lets me choose the current point in time. I have a range slider that lets me define where along my range I want to focus, and this is good for focusing in on specific areas. I can drag the range slider on either end, or I can type in a value in the two inner boxes. This one I can type in the beginning of the selected range, and in this one I can type in the end. And then the outer boxes set the beginning and end of the sequence. So right now my sequence ends at 200 frames. My current range ends at 120. So if I want my entire sequence to last only 120 frames, I can set that to 120. And then I can focus within that. I also have some playback buttons here that I can use as I preview my animation. Now to start animating, the first thing I want to do is just position the ball using my translate group where I want the animation to start. Now there's still no animation, there are no keyframes set, so the ball sits in one position if I drag the slider or press play. So I need to start by, from the animation menu set and the key menu, I need to set a key. You can see that red marks were added to the channels in the channel box. A red line was added in the time slider. I can still hit play and nothing appears to happen because I only have one keyframe, and a keyframe just locks a channel in time to a specific position. Now later on in my sequence, I want to drag the ball forward, and you can see there's still no red mark, and these have become pink, indicating that these channels are animated but not keyed on the current time or the current frame. So I need to set another key, and now the ball will animate from one point to the other. If I press play, it's going to look a little bit too fast. So if I go to the playback menu, I can set the playback speed, and I prefer the play every frame max real time because then I don't miss any of the action. If I need to evaluate animation, I always need to see every frame. Now if I hit play, it plays at a much more reasonable pace. So one thing you'll notice in this sequence, and I'll focus the range slider down to 80 frames. When I hit play, you can see that the ball accelerates at the beginning and it decelerates at the end, so it feels kind of soft. Now I want that not to accelerate at the beginning, so I will change this key by right-clicking and choosing from the tangent submenu. I will choose linear. Now when I press play, it doesn't appear to accelerate at the beginning, it only decelerates at the end. It starts as if it was in motion. So the sequence that I want to create is the ball bouncing into frame and coming to rest. And if it's going to bounce into frame, it needs to start in motion already, as if somebody off screen threw the ball. Now you'll see if I select by clicking, it picks the geometry, not any of the three groups above it. A simple trick I can use is with the arrow keys, I can press up arrow to get the parent of the selected object. So I can quickly up and down arrow through this simple hierarchy to get to my different objects. With the translate node, now I want to decide where this is going to bounce. I'll make this bounce a few times, so I move forward in time and press S because I want it to hit the ground at this point. I'll go forward in time a little bit more and press S and do that a few more times. So it'll bounce, 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 bounce. It's still not moving up though, it's only locked in time at these positions. Now if I go back to the beginning and move this ball to a different position, so there's a key on this frame already, but it's different than the value that's currently set, and that's indicated by the color marking here. I can choose key, set key again, to lock this new position at this current time, and now the ball moves from this position to the next. I can simplify this process by turning on auto keyframing. It's this button down in the lower right, and when that's set, any value that I change the affected channel will also get keyed automatically. So if I start in between these two frames that I've established as the ground and pull the ball up, I now see that this indicates I have a keyframe on the Y channel only because I only dragged this up. So I'll do the same thing a few more times. I want this ball to bounce a little bit less each time. And let's hit play and see what it looks like. It looks not really great. And the reason is because it's, as it did the first time when I keyframed, it's accelerating from the start and it's decelerating into each position, going up and down. It's accelerating down, it's decelerating towards the bottom, and then accelerating up again and decelerating at the top. For a proper bounce, it really should accelerate all the way down and decelerate all the way up. It should not ever decelerate on the way down. It should not ever accelerate on the way up. And the easiest way to visualize that is with the graph editor. So I'll switch to the graph editor. And now if I focus on the translate Y, you can see a little bit better why this looks like it's not going to work well, because this doesn't look like the path that a ball would bounce on. It looks like a wiggly wave. So we'll take a look at individual keyframes and their tangents now. This keyframe, the tangents are indicated by these handles. For this one, the tangent points down, and I'll use the move tool to drag it. So now it accelerates on the way down. It starts from a stop or a flat slope, and the slope increases. That means it gets faster and faster. Now when the slope is decreasing, it's getting slower. I don't want that to happen, so I need to then affect the tangent at the bottom end. I can drag this up, but now you see the outgoing tangent points down, so I need to now break this tangent handle using the break tangent button, or under tangents, break tangents, and that allows me to aim them different directions. Now I'll break the tangents of all the keys that are at the ground level all at once to make this easier. And then zoom in. Now I can also zoom horizontally or vertically in this view by pressing Alt and then right click, Alt Shift and then right click, and it'll zoom in whichever direction I drag first. So Alt Shift right click and drag left or right, it zooms that way. Alt Shift and right click, drag up or down, it zooms vertically. Now as I position all these handles, I'm not even looking at the animation because I can tell from this curvature whether it's going to look better or not. If this doesn't look like a ball bouncing, then it's not going to feel like a ball bouncing when I watch the animation. Now I've also not been paying much attention to timing yet. It may be too slow or too fast at some point, but I'm not worried about that yet. Okay, so that's feeling better. It feels like it's bouncing and hitting the ground relatively hard now. But it's going a bit too slow, especially at the beginning and the very end. I want that first one to come in pretty fast, and I want the last couple of bounces to be fast as well. So I need to switch my view. I'll choose a layout from the hotbox top quadrant. I'll use perspective graph, so I can see both the graph and the animation at the same time. From the perspective view, I'll choose camera settings, the view, camera settings, and then overscan, so that I can see all of the animation. with overscan turned on, I also need to visualize what will actually be rendered. So I'll turn on the render gate, and this shows me the resolution up at top, the name of the camera at the bottom, and everything outside this box won't render. So I'll do some retiming now. I'll stop my playback and take a look at my channels. Now, one thing I want to be sure about when I'm retiming is that the keys I'm moving are supposed to be moved, or that the keys are even needed. In this case, translate Z, I haven't moved my ball forward or back in depth at all. So I really don't want any keys other than the beginning and the end. Translate X, this is my ball as it moves across the screen. I don't really want these keys either, because I don't want this changing speed. I want it only gradually decelerating. And I may fine-tune the deceleration now just to make it look a little better. Okay, so with all of those extra keys deleted, I can now shift-click a frame in the timeline, then middle-click to reposition it in time. So I want that first bounce to come a little earlier. I want the second bounce to be just a hair shorter. The third bounce to be shorter than that. The fourth to be significantly shorter. And the last to be barely visible at all. I'll just make it happen across 2 frames. So let's try playing that back now with that timing. Now it pops quite a bit too much at the end, and there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it bounces too high, and second, it may still actually be too quick. So I'll change both of those things by retiming, and I can also retime right in the graph editor just by moving the keys I want to time out. And let's play back and see if that feels better. So that's a little bit better. I didn't fix the height problem though. It's still much too high on that bounce. And now I've changed the height without fixing the tangents, so I have a height that looks like it pops up and floats. So I need to fix those tangents. That feels better to me. Now it's also not rolling, so let's deal with rolling. And remember, I made 3 levels of hierarchy: translate, which I've already animated, scale, and rotate. Now I'll select the rotate item and keyframe at the beginning by pressing S. That keys those channels. Keyframe at the end, again by pressing S. And I'm going to roll it forward by some amount and see how that looks. Now that actually looks pretty good to me. I eyeballed it and it's pretty close, but we can still refine it a little bit. Let's look at the graph editor again, and we can see that it is accelerating at the beginning and decelerating at the end. So again, I don't want to accelerate at the beginning. I want this to start at a higher speed and always slow down. I can also use these buttons up here to set specific styles of tangent. And in the case of a tangent that I want decelerating from a stop, or decelerating to a stop, or accelerating from a stop, I want to choose the flat tangents button. So now the rotation doesn't look quite so good at the end, it's slipping. And that tells me it's not rotating far enough, because it looks like it's rolling very slowly. So I'll pause playback, up arrow to select the rotate, move towards the end, and roll this a little bit more and see what happens. It still doesn't go quite far enough. Now let's look at this in the graph editor. And this actually may be better visualized in the front view. And in the front view I can zoom in on it and see if the lines on the sphere are lining up with grid lines on the ground. If I press 4 on the keyboard, then I don't have to have it selected to see it. I do still need to have the correct node selected, but I can pin the rotate Z channel, the one that's doing all the work here, into the graph editor by clicking this pin button. Now I don't need to have it selected for that graph to stay visible. At the end, now I want to select that last keyframe and drag it down to increase the amount that it's rolling. And you can see the ball rotate as I move this. And then drag it to see if it's working. It's still sliding a bit. So as I fine tune it, you can see it gets closer and closer to appearing as if the lines stay relatively in the same place on this horizontal axis. Now this doesn't always have to be perfect. Animation is often a game of tricking the eye, not necessarily perfecting things like the exact amount of rotation that needs to happen. So this is really best previewed from the perspective view, or from the camera you're going to render from. And if it looks like it's rolling okay in this view, then it is rolling okay. Lastly, I want to work on squash and stretch. Back to the outliner, I want to make sure I select my scale node. And for this pass, I'll be scaling as the ball hits the ground and then scaling up to do a little bit of bounce back. So I actually want to set a keyframe just before the ball hits the ground on every one of these bounces. So I'll press S as I find the frame just before the bounce. And this could also be pretty easily done in the graph editor if I choose the translate and pin in the translate Y curve. I'll actually pin rotate Z as well so that I can see it. And you can see that the rotate values are much larger than the scale and the translate values, and that's because when we're using angular rotation, the values can be up, up in the hundreds. So there's a nice little button in this view that allows me to normalize the curves. So if I choose this Enable Normalized Curve Display, then all the curves are fitted into a range between 0 and 1. Now it's not actually changing the values, it's just displaying all the curves together in a sensible sort of range. Now again, I'll go to the frame just before the last time the ball hits the ground and set another keyframe. And now I'll start at the first bounce. As soon as the ball hits the ground, I want this squashing quite a bit. I'll make this fairly exaggerated, and then squashing outward as well. So I want the ball scaling down and scaling proportionally outward so that it appears as if it preserves volume. If I didn't scale outward, if I didn't make it fatter at the same time as being flatter, then it would just look like the ball gets flat in a bizarre way. It's not actually staying inflated. So I can proportionally scale on two axes by pressing Control and then click and drag this handle. I can also find the proportional scaling handle, which is here. And in the perspective view, I could tumble around and find the proportional handle for this item. Okay, so my ball flattens, but it doesn't get back to its normal shape again until the next bounce. So I actually want it to return to normal somewhere before the end, maybe about here. I'll set the scaling to 1 so it's back to its normal shape. That still is not doing what it should, so in order to appear really elastic, I'd want this to scale both up too far and in so that it is stretching. And let's play that back and see how it looks. It looks a little weird. It sort of restores itself slowly, and then it smoothly goes back to the next position. So I want to change this a little bit by first retiming just a hair. I moved that stretch back one frame, and then splitting the difference between the current frame and the next, the current keyframe and the next. I actually want to squash this one more time so that it appears kind of elastic. It bounces up and squashes out and then restores itself. Now that feels a bit too extreme, so I'm going to scale this down a little and try again. Okay, and that's looking all right for the first bounce. The next two, the ball looks like a steel ball bearing because it's not stretching at all. So rather than repeat all of those steps to get a nice squash and stretch for each subsequent bounce, I will copy and paste keyframes. I'm going to clean up this view by unpinning those extra channels, and I'll look only at the first bounce and squash. So I want to take these keys, so the sequence starts here. This is the ball before it hits the ground, and the first keyframe of it squashing is here. The last keyframe of this bounce cycle is here, but the last frame of the squash and stretch is there. So everything in between those I want selected. I'll choose Edit Copy and go to the next keyframe, and again 1 frame forward, and then choose Edit Paste. First I'll choose the options box to make sure this is doing what I want it to do though. So I'll reset paste settings and turn on Help Images. And this allows me to visualize how the paste is going to happen. I want this to be a merge type. If I chose Insert, then it would be stretching out my sequence. If I chose Connect, then the pasted keys would actually start at the current value rather than at their absolute value, the values that were copied. So again, I want the merge setting, I don't want it connecting, and I'll choose Paste Keys. That pastes them into the sequence. Because this one was shorter than the last keyframe is closer to the next. So I want this to happen over a little bit less time. I'm going to use the Scale tool. And now the Tool Settings window. To use a manipulator style of Scale tool in the graph editor. So I can grab just one end of it and scale towards that end. And that retimes those keys. I will copy and again pass the next frame, paste. You can see that it pasted not just into this range but out beyond that range. So what I need to do is paste and make a note of which keys were there before, and I need to not move those. I'll scale these inside that range. And I won't do any squash and stretch on the last bounce because it's so small. Now this is going to look strange when I animate it. It's going to look like it squashes and stretches too much on the second and third bounce. So I need to scale that down. So I can scale the height of each subsequent squash and stretch. I could do this by moving individual points around, but I'd rather use the Scale tool. It makes it much easier. In the current view, that's not going to be easy because I'm using the normalized curve display. I want to disable normalized curve display so that I can see the scaling relative to 1. I see that it scales up and out in different directions, and I want to make sure that I scale only towards and away from the 1 value. Now, I also don't want to have this manipulator in here. I want the gestural style of scale, so I went to the tool settings to change that. And with my mouse on that one line, I want to middle click and drag up or down to scale in that direction. So I can make the entire squash and stretch a bit shorter or less extreme. And I'll do that with the third bounce as well. Now I can see that each subsequent bounce is less squashy and stretchy, or has less power, because it's being absorbed by the elastic nature of the ball. And I'll play back again. And that's working much better now.